The sun hung low in the sky, casting long shadows over the village of Pinebrook. Jake Evans wiped the sweat from his brow, his bike screeching to a stop in front of his best friend Sam's house. "Come on, Sam. We're wasting daylight," Jake called, hopping off his bike. Sam peeked his head out the window, grinning. I'm coming. He darted out the door, his little sister, Lily, in tow. "Where's Emily?" Sam asked. "She'll meet us at the cemetery," Jake replied. His stomach churned a little at the thought of the place, but he wasn't about to show it. After all, it was just an old graveyard, nothing more. The four of them had been friends since forever, and summer in Pinebrook meant finding ways to entertain themselves. Today, their adventure was exploring the abandoned cemetery at the edge of the village, a place their parents always told them to avoid. It didn't take long before they arrived. Emily was already there, kicking at the dirt near a toppled gravestone. "Took you long enough," she teased. Her brown hair glowed in the fading sunlight, and she gave them a mischievous grin. Jake shrugged. "Had to wait for slowpokes over here." They all laughed, but the laughter faded as they stepped closer to the graves. The cemetery was quiet. Too quiet. The only sound was the whisper of the wind through the trees. "Let's see who can find the creepiest grave," Sam suggested, trying to lighten the mood. They split up, each wandering through the rows of old crumbling tombstones. It wasn't long before Lily, Sam's little sister, called out, "Guys, come look at this." The three of them hurried over to where she was standing, her eyes wide with excitement. In front of her was a mound of dirt that looked freshly disturbed, but there was no gravestone. "Someone was digging here," Lily said, pointing at the ground. Jake's heart raced. Maybe an animal? But as he knelt down, he saw something sticking out from the earth. Something that looked like a book. "Help me," Jake said, already starting to pull the object free. Together, they tugged at it, and slowly, the dirt gave way. It was a thick, leather-bound book, its cover worn and cracked. The title was barely legible, but after wiping away the dirt, they saw it. The Story of Sarah. A cold shiver ran down Jake's spine, and for a moment, no one spoke. "Sarah?" Emily whispered. "Who's Sarah?" Sam looked over at Jake, his face pale. "I think we found something we shouldn't have." Jake stood, clutching the book tightly in his hands. "Let's take it back to my house. We'll figure it out there." As they mounted their bikes and rode back toward the village, none of them noticed the shadow that passed over the cemetery, and none of them saw the figure watching them from behind an old, cracked tombstone. That evening, the four kids gathered in Jake's room. The book sat between them on the floor, its cover seeming darker under the soft light of the lamp. "Are we sure we want to read this?" Lily asked, her voice uncertain. Jake swallowed hard, but nodded. "We have to. We found it, didn't we?" Emily bit her lip. "Fine, but if it gets too weird, we stop, okay?" Jake opened the book, half expecting it to crumble in his hands. The first few pages were blank, but as he turned the next one, words began to form right in front of them. "Whoa," Sam whispered, his eyes wide. "It's writing itself." The words that appeared were in simple, neat handwriting. "The children came to the cemetery today. They dug up the book from the grave. They didn't know they had awoken Sarah." A cold chill filled the room as Jake read the words aloud. But what sent their hearts racing was what came next. Jake, Emily, Sam, and Lily were about to learn that some secrets should stay buried. Silence fell over the room as the kids stared at one another, fear creeping into their eyes. "How does it know our names?" Lily asked, her voice trembling. Jake shut the book, his hands shaking. "I don't know, but something's not right. We need to find out more about this Sarah." Emily stood up, pacing the room. "This is insane. We should just put the book back where we found it." But none of them could deny the pull of the book, the feeling that there was more they needed to uncover. And as the night deepened, they all felt the same unsettling thought. Maybe it was already too late. The next morning, Jake was the first to wake up, his eyes still heavy from the restless sleep that had haunted him all night. He couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong. That book, it felt like it was watching them, as if it knew something they didn't. He glanced at his clock. 9 a.m. Emily was supposed to meet them half an hour ago to figure out what to do next. He checked his phone. No messages. Maybe she overslept, Jake muttered to himself as he got dressed. By 10 a.m., there was still no sign of her. When Sam and Lily arrived at Jake's house, they could sense something was off. "She's never this late," Lily said, frowning. "I hope she's okay." "We should go to her house," Sam suggested, his voice quieter than usual. Jake nodded. "Let's go." The walk to Emily's house felt longer than usual, every step heavy with an uneasy tension. As they approached, the front door opened, and Emily's mother, Mrs. Turner, stepped out, looking worried. "Jake, Sam, Lily, have you seen Emily?" Mrs. Turner asked, her voice trembling. Jake exchanged a glance with Sam, a knot forming in his stomach. She was supposed to meet us this morning," he said slowly. "Why? Is something wrong?" Mrs. Turner's eyes widened. "She didn't come home last night. I've been calling her all morning, but she's not answering." The world around Jake seemed to spin. Emily didn't come home? His mind raced back to the cemetery, to the book. His throat felt tight. Sam spoke up. "Mrs. Turner, maybe she just got distracted or went somewhere else. We'll help you look for her." But as the three of them left Emily's house, they couldn't hide their fear from each other. "You don't think," Lily began, her voice shaking, "do you think the book did something to her?" Jake's heart pounded in his chest. "I don't know, but we need to check the book." They hurried back to Jake's house, their feet pounding against the pavement. As soon as they burst into his room, Jake grabbed the book from where he'd hidden it under his bed. He opened it, his hands trembling. The words on the page seemed to stare back at him, mocking. Emily didn't make it home that night. She vanished near the place where Sarah's story began. Jake's breath caught in his throat. The book had written about Emily's disappearance before they even knew she was missing. Sam's face paled. "How is this possible? How does it know?" Lily's eyes filled with tears. "We have to find her. We have to get her back." Jake slammed the book shut. "This is more than a ghost story. Something's using this book. Something evil. We need help." They all knew who they had to go to. There was only one person in the village who might know what to do next. The door to Margaret Harlow's house creaked open slowly, revealing the tiny, hunched figure of the village's oldest resident. Her eyes, sharp, and knowing despite her age, peered at the three children standing nervously on her porch. "What are you doing here?" she asked, her voice rasping like dry leaves in the wind. Jake stepped forward, clutching the book tightly in his hands. "We need your help," he said, his voice barely above a whisper. "It's about Sarah." At the mention of the name, Margaret's eyes darkened, and she pulled the door open wider. "Come in," she said quietly. The inside of her house smelled of old wood and herbs, and the air was thick with an eerie silence. The children sat down on the worn furniture as Margaret took a seat across from them, her eyes never leaving the book in Jake's hands. "You found it," she said, her voice low. "Sarah's book." Jake nodded, his heart racing. We found it buried in the cemetery, but now it's writing about us and our friend Emily. She's missing. The book says she's gone." Margaret's gaze grew distant, as though she was staring into the past. It was only a matter of time before someone found it again, she murmured. "Sarah, she was never at rest." Lily, her voice small, asked, "Who is Sarah? What does she want?" Margaret sighed heavily, leaning back in her chair. Sarah was a young girl who lived in this village many years ago. She was different from the others, gifted in ways that frightened the villagers. They called her a witch, blamed her for every misfortune that happened here. A fire, a drought, a sickness. Whatever went wrong, it was Sarah's fault. "She wasn't a witch?" Sam asked, his voice hesitant. Margaret shook her head. "No, she wasn't. But fear makes people cruel. They accused her, and before long, the village turned against her. They buried her alive in the cemetery, thinking it would end the misfortunes. But Sarah's spirit, it never left. She cursed the land, cursed anyone who disturbed her grave." Jake's grip on the book tightened. "And the book?" "The book is her way of keeping her story alive," Margaret explained. "She writes the fate of anyone who touches it. It's her way of exacting revenge." Tears welled up in Lily's eyes. "But Emily, she didn't do anything. None of us did." Margaret's gaze softened for a moment, but her voice remained firm. "Sarah doesn't care. To her, anyone who finds the book is part of her story, and she won't stop until her story is finished." A heavy silence fell over the room as the weight of Margaret's words settled in. "So, what do we do?" Sam asked, desperation in his voice. "How do we stop her?" Margaret sighed, her fingers tracing the lines of her worn wooden chair. "The only way to stop Sarah is to return the book to her grave. But it won't be easy. Sarah's spirit will fight to keep her story alive. And there's a price to pay for crossing her." Jake's heart sank. "A price?" Margaret nodded gravely. "To end the curse, you must perform a ritual at Sarah's grave. But the ritual requires a sacrifice. Something precious must be given up. If you're not willing to pay the price, then Sarah will claim all of you." Lily wiped her eyes, her voice trembling. "But what if we can't do it? What if we don't make it?" Margaret's gaze lingered on each of them, her expression unreadable. "That's a choice you'll have to make. But if you do nothing, Sarah will continue to write your story until there's no one left to tell it." Jake's mind whirled, fear and dread twisting in his stomach. Emily was gone. Sam and Lily were terrified, and now they knew that Sarah's curse was more dangerous than they ever could have imagined. But he also knew They had no other option. They had to end this. They had to break the curse. "We'll do it," Jake said, his voice steady, despite the fear gnawing at him. "We'll end Sarah's story, whatever it takes." Margaret nodded slowly. "Then you must prepare yourselves. The ritual will take place at midnight, on the night of the full moon. You have until then to decide what you're willing to sacrifice." Jake glanced at Sam and Lily, both of whom were pale but determined. They were in this together, and as they left Margaret's house, the weight of what lay ahead settled on their shoulders. Sarah's story wasn't over yet, but they were about to write the final chapter. The tension in the air hung heavy as the sun dipped behind the horizon. Jake, Sam, and Lily sat in Jake's room once more, the cursed book resting ominously on the floor between them. The words Margaret had spoken earlier replayed in Jake's mind. A price must be paid. "We're running out of time," Jake said, his voice strained. "We have to end this before it takes another one of us." Lily looked pale, her eyes red from crying. What if Emily's already gone? What if she's dead? "We don't know that yet," Sam said quickly, though there was little conviction in his voice. "We just have to figure out how to do the ritual and—" The book on the floor suddenly fluttered open, its pages turning rapidly on their own. The three of them froze as the once blank page slowly filled with new writing. Jake's heart pounded in his chest as he leaned closer to read the words. Sam took the book home that night. He thought he could outsmart Sarah, but Sarah already knew what he would do. She was waiting. Sam's face drained of color as he backed away from the book. No, that's not going to happen. "We have to stay together," Jake said urgently. "We can't let Sarah separate us." Sam shook his head. "I'm not letting that thing control my life." He grabbed the book from the floor, his fingers trembling as he held it close to his chest. "I'm taking it home. I'll figure it out. I'm not going to wait for Sarah to take me." "Sam, no," Lily cried, but Sam was already out the door, running down the street. Jake wanted to stop him, but the fear in his own chest froze him in place. He knew the curse was real. He had seen Emily disappear, and now the book was writing their lives, one by one. Lily looked up at Jake, her voice trembling. "What are we going to do?" Jake clenched his fists, his mind racing. "We can't let Sam be alone tonight. We'll go to his house and keep watch." By the time they reached Sam's house, the lights inside were off. The eerie quiet of the night felt suffocating as they stood outside the front door. "We have to go in," Jake said, swallowing his fear. They pushed the door open, the hinges creaking loudly in the silence. Inside, the house was dark, but the sound of something rustling in the living room caught their attention. Jake's heart pounded as they stepped into the room and froze. Sam was sitting on the floor, the book open in front of him. His eyes were glazed, staring blankly ahead. "Sam?" Lily whispered, stepping closer. "Are you okay?" But as she approached, Sam's body slumped forward, his face hitting the ground with a sickening thud. Jake rushed to his side, shaking him. "Sam, wake up!" But Sam didn't respond. His skin was cold, and his breathing was shallow. Jake's eyes flicked to the book, which now had a new entry written in neat, haunting script. Sam didn't make it through the night. Sarah's story continued. Lily's scream echoed through the house as she knelt beside her brother, sobbing uncontrollably. Jake's heart shattered, fear and grief twisting inside him like a knife. Sam was gone, just like Emily, and now they were running out of time. The next day was a blur of fear and grief. Sam's parents were devastated, and the village was buzzing with rumors. No one could explain what had happened to him, just as no one had been able to explain Emily's disappearance. But Jake knew. Sarah was writing their story, and there was only one chapter left. "We have to go back to Margaret," Jake said, as they sat in his room, Lily still sniffling quietly. Her eyes were puffy from crying all night, and Jake could barely keep himself together. He had failed to protect his friends. "Do you think she can help us stop this?" Lily asked, her voice small. "We don't have a choice," Jake replied, his voice hardening with determination. "If we don't end this, we'll be next." That evening, they made their way back to Margaret's house. The old woman seemed to be expecting them, opening the door before they had a chance to knock. "It's time, isn't it?" she said quietly, her eyes scanning the two remaining children. Jake nodded, the weight of Sam's death still fresh in his mind. "Sam is gone. We have to stop Sarah before she takes Lily or me." Margaret ushered them inside, her face grave. "The full moon is tomorrow night. That's when the ritual must be performed. You'll need to return the book to Sarah's grave and perform the binding spell." Lily shifted uncomfortably. "What's the price, Margaret? What do we have to give up?" The old woman sighed, her eyes full of sorrow. "To stop Sarah, you must sacrifice something precious. A life for a life." Jake's heart sank. "What do you mean?" Margaret's eyes flicked toward Lily. "One of you must give your life to break the curse. That's the only way to satisfy Sarah's anger. If you don't, she'll keep coming for you." Lily gasped, her face pale. No, there has to be another way." But Margaret's expression remained firm. "The curse is older than all of us. It demands blood." Jake's mind raced, the horror of what Margaret was saying sinking in. How could he ask Lily to sacrifice her life? How could he live with himself if he let Sarah take another one of his friends? "I'll do it," Jake said suddenly, his voice shaking but determined. Lily's eyes widened. "Jake, no, you can't." "I have to," Jake insisted. "This is my fault. I was the one who found the book. I brought us into this. If it's going to end, it has to be me." Tears streamed down Lily's face. "But I can't lose you too. I can't." Jake reached out, placing a hand on her shoulder. "We don't have a choice. It's the only way to stop her." Margaret nodded solemnly. "If you're willing, the ritual will work, but you must be prepared. Sarah's spirit will fight back." As the full moon rose in the sky the following night, Jake and Lily made their way back to the cemetery, the book clutched tightly in Jake's hands. The wind howled through the trees, and the darkness felt suffocating. "Are you ready?" Lily asked, her voice trembling. Jake nodded, though fear gnawed at his insides. "We have to be." They reached the grave, an unmarked mound of earth near the spot where they had first found the book. The air around them felt thick, almost like something was watching, waiting. Jake opened the book to the last page, where the final chapter of their story was yet to be written. He pulled a small candle from his bag, lighting it carefully and placing it on the ground beside the grave. "We need to say the words," Jake said, pulling out the slip of paper Margaret had given him, with the ancient spell scrawled across it. Lily's hands trembled as she held the paper, her voice barely a whisper as she began to chant the binding spell. But as the words left her mouth, a cold wind swept through the cemetery, and the ground beneath their feet began to tremble. A low, guttural growl echoed in the darkness, and suddenly a figure appeared, a dark, shadowy figure standing at the edge of the graveyard. It was Sarah. Her eyes glowed with malice, her ghostly form flickering in the dim moonlight. "She's here," Lily whispered, her voice full of fear. Jake's heart pounded in his chest as he stepped forward, clutching the book tightly in his hands. "This ends now," he said, his voice shaking but determined. Sarah's figure moved closer, her presence suffocating, as if the very air around them was being drained of life. The air around Jake and Lily grew colder, heavier, as Sarah's ghostly form moved closer. Her presence was suffocating, like a dark fog wrapping around them. Jake's heart pounded in his chest, but he couldn't back down now. If they didn't finish this ritual, Sarah's curse would continue, claiming them both. Lily was frozen in place, her eyes wide with terror. "Jake, what do we do?" Jake glanced at the candle flickering beside the grave, the book clutched tightly in his hands. He could feel the pull of Sarah's spirit, the malevolence emanating from her, but he forced himself to focus. "We finish the ritual. Keep reading the spell, no matter what happens." Lily's hands trembled as she lifted the paper with the spell written on it. Her voice was shaky, barely above a whisper, but she began to speak the ancient words again. "Exaudi nos, anima irata, audacta terrogo." The ground beneath them trembled, and Sarah's form seemed to flicker, her eyes glowing with a terrifying light. A gust of wind whipped through the cemetery, nearly snuffing out the candle. Sarah was resisting. Jake knelt beside the grave, feeling the cold earth beneath his hands. He placed the book on top of Sarah's unmarked grave, pressing it down as if to return it to the place it belonged. Suddenly, a loud, guttural scream tore through the night. Sarah's ghostly figure lunged toward them, her hand reaching for Jake. "No!" Lily screamed, her voice breaking with fear. She dropped the paper, rushing to stand between Jake and Sarah's approaching form. "Leave him alone." But Sarah's spirit was relentless. Her cold, shadowy hand brushed against Lily's arm, and instantly, Lily collapsed to the ground, her body convulsing as the curse took hold of her. "Lily!" Jake shouted, panic gripping him as he knelt beside her. Her skin had gone pale, and her breathing was shallow. She was slipping away, just like Sam and Emily. Tears welled in Jake's eyes. "You can't take her. Take me instead," he yelled, his voice cracking with desperation. But Sarah's spirit only watched, her form twisting and writhing as if feeding off Lily's life force. The wind howled louder, and the darkness seemed to close in around them. Jake knew what he had to do. He couldn't let Sarah take Lily. If the curse demanded a life, it had to be his. With trembling hands, Jake grabbed the book once more, holding it above Sarah's grave. He could feel the cold, dark energy radiating from it, pulling at his very soul. "I give my life to end this," he shouted into the night. "Take me instead." A deep silence fell over the cemetery. The wind stopped, and for a moment, everything was still. Sarah's ghostly form hovered in place, her glowing eyes locked on Jake. Then slowly, she began to move toward him, her hand outstretched. Jake braced himself, his heart pounding in his chest. He felt the cold fingers of Sarah's spirit wrap around his arm, pulling him toward her. His vision blurred, and he felt a wave of exhaustion wash over him, draining him of his strength. But as Sarah pulled him closer, Jake noticed something. The book. The pages had begun to glow faintly, a soft light emanating from within its covers. It was reacting to the ritual, to the sacrifice he was offering. With the last of his strength, Jake pressed the book firmly into the ground, shouting the final words of the spell. "Rest in peace, Sarah. Your story is over." The ground beneath him shook violently, and Sarah's scream filled the air once more. But this time, it wasn't a scream of anger. It was a scream of release. The glowing light from the book intensified, enveloping Sarah's form in a brilliant white light. Jake collapsed to the ground, his body weak, as Sarah's spirit began to fade. The cold air lifted, and the oppressive darkness that had surrounded them dissipated. The curse was breaking. Jake lay on the ground, gasping for breath as the weight of what had just happened settled over him. The night was eerily quiet now, the cemetery bathed in a soft, pale moonlight. Sarah's presence was gone. "Lily," Jake whispered, crawling toward her still form. His heart raced with fear. Had he been too late? Lily was lying on the cold earth, her face pale, her body still. Jake's chest tightened as he knelt beside her, shaking her gently. "Lily, please, wake up." For a moment, there was nothing. Lily's eyes remained closed, her breathing shallow. Tears welled up in Jake's eyes as he realized what he had feared most. Lily had given too much. The curse had taken her. "No," Jake whispered, his voice breaking. "Please, don't leave me." He sat there for what felt like hours, the weight of grief crushing him. He had tried to protect her, to stop the curse from claiming another life, but it hadn't been enough. He had failed her, just like he had failed Emily and Sam. But then, as the moonlight washed over them, something happened. Lily's hand twitched. Her chest rose, just barely, as she took in a slow, shallow breath. "Lily?" Jake whispered, hope surging through him. Her eyes fluttered open, weak and unfocused, but alive. "Jake," she murmured, her voice barely audible. Relief washed over Jake as he helped her sit up. She was weak, but she was alive. "You're okay," Jake said, his voice shaking. "You're okay." Lily looked around, confused. What happened?" "It's over," Jake said, his voice filled with emotion. "We did it. The curse is broken." Lily's eyes widened as she realized what had just occurred. She looked at the spot where Sarah's spirit had stood, now empty and peaceful. "Is she gone?" Jake nodded, wiping the tears from his eyes. "She's gone. For good." Lily leaned against him, exhausted but grateful. They had made it. They had survived. As they sat there in the quiet of the cemetery, the first rays of dawn began to break over the horizon. The curse had ended, but the memories of what they had endured would stay with them forever. Jake and Lily stood up slowly, their bodies aching from the ordeal. They looked at the grave one last time, the book now buried beneath the earth where it belonged. Sarah's story was over, and her spirit could finally rest in peace. But as they left the cemetery, Jake couldn't help but wonder. Sarah's curse had been powerful, so powerful that it had almost claimed them all. Was it really gone for good? Only time would tell. For now, they had won. They had written the final chapter of Sarah's story, and they had survived to tell it. But deep down, Jake knew some stories never truly end. As they walked home together, the morning sun rising behind them, Jake couldn't shake the feeling that Sarah's presence still lingered, watching, waiting. Because in the end, a story as dark as Sarah's doesn't fade so easily, and some secrets are never truly buried.